At the end of the first side of the Beatles' iconic Abbey Road album is a track called I Want You, She's So Heavy. It's one of the most richly layered, intriguing, and powerful performances, and the last song that all four Beatles worked on together as a band. But there's an interesting anomaly that you might not have noticed. And as a fair warning, once I point it out, you can't unhear this. It happens at around 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Listen carefully to the moment after John screams. Yeah! Did you hear it? Someone in the background is clearly shouting something. There's an old theory that this was someone in the control room, yelling at John for screaming too loudly a moment before, which caused distortion on the tape. But that theory is wrong. For one, no one would dare shout at a Beatle during a recording session. Hey, hey, hey! But there's even more conclusive proof to discredit that theory, as I'll demonstrate in a moment. Let's listen again, this time to an isolated track of only the drums. You probably noticed that the mysterious ghost vocal actually happens twice, once before John's distorted scream and again after. So clearly it couldn't have been a reaction to John's scream. The reason we're hearing it on the drum track is because the microphones used to record the drums are often sensitive enough to pick up extraneous noise in the recording studio. So what exactly is this mysterious ghost vocal we're hearing? Well, I think it's likely that it's one of the other Beatles, possibly Paul or even John himself. It picked up during the recording of the backing track. When isolated, it doesn't actually sound like words, but more like singing along to the bass line in that section. Here's the bass line. And again, the ghost vocal. To understand how this ghost vocal even made it into the mix, we need to examine the convoluted 8-month-long journey of the recording and re-recording of this song. We start back in January 1969 during the ill-fated Get Back sessions, when John introduced to the group a rough concept for a song called But the song wasn't formally recorded until February 22, 1969, when the band convened at Trident Studios under the guidance of producer George Martin. Starting in the evening and continuing until almost dawn, they knocked out a marathon session consisting of 35 takes of the song. On a side note, there's a funny outtake from this night in which one of the studio engineers reports that a neighbor called to complain about the noise the band was making at such a late hour.
What are they doing here at this time of night?
Anyway, the next day the band met to review the 35 takes they had recorded. John, being very picky, wasn't happy with any single take all the way through. So instead he had the engineers join 3 different takes, take 9, take 20, and take 32, into one single backing track. And the ghost vocal probably comes from one of these takes, maybe take 20. This nearly seamless combination of 3 takes was only the beginning of the extensive work that the group would apply to the track over the next 6 months. Just 2 days later, on February 24th, the group recorded piano, guitar, tambourine, and even a reverse cymbal. But interestingly, none of these overdubs were used on the final track. The band then took a break from working on the song for almost 2 months. On April 18th, John and George returned to the studio to overdub more guitar tracks to enhance the heavy, droning sound that John had in mind. On April 20th, Ringo added conga drums. And guest keyboardist Billy Preston added a groovy organ track. On August 8, 1969, back at Abbey Road Studios, John, in one of his experimental moods, decided to use a then cutting-edge Moog analog synthesizer to add white noise that would incrementally get louder during the last 2 minutes of the song. Ringo also added a bit more percussion to the outro at the same session. Oddly enough, these new overdubs were not added to the latest version of the song from April, but instead to the original recording from Trident Studios back in February. So now there were effectively two versions of the song, the version from April, using the February backing track plus overdubbed organ, congas, and extra guitars, and this version from August 8th with the added white noise and extra percussion. But if you can believe it, this was still not the end of the madness. A few days later, on August 11th, John, Paul, and George added gorgeous harmonized vocals. These vocals were then overdubbed onto both versions of the recording, since John couldn't decide which version he ultimately preferred. On August 20th, with the album's completion date approaching, the band finally had to answer the question of what to do with the two existing versions of the song. John ultimately decided on a compromise that was very similar to what he had requested a few years earlier for Strawberry Fields Forever. Combine them. And so the band opted to keep the April version for the first 4 minutes and 37 seconds, and then cut to the February version for the rest of the song. So what you're hearing today is essentially a combination of those two versions. With the stitching of the mixes figured out, John had one last trick up his sleeve. Instead of having the song end with a normal fade out or on the last note of the performance, he asked the engineers to simply cut the tape, creating an abrupt ending that would mark the end of side one of Abbey Road. But that wasn't the only abrupt end on that day. It was also the last time that all four Beatles were present together working at Abbey Road Studios, the place they had called their professional home for the past 7 years, where countless pop masterpieces had been forged. It was truly the end of an era. Now that's heavy. All the overdubbing and mixing complexity aside, what really makes I Want You so sublime is the musicianship itself. It features every element that made the Beatles so magical, wrapped in a transcendent blowout performance. And the isolated tracks reveal just how richly layered this masterpiece is. For example, Paul's masterful bass lines during the outro. Even better, on the isolated drum track, you can hear an awesome guitar solo that's lost in the final mix. I can't say enough about how much I adore this song. It's as brooding and heavy as anything that Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, or the Velvet Underground were doing around this time. And no matter how many times I've heard it, I find it equally hypnotizing. And somehow most fittingly, their very last song rhymes both in sound and in meaning with their very first single from all the way back in 1962. Love me do. Funny how that turned out. Anyway, what do you think about I Want You, She's So Heavy? Let me know in the comments, and as always, please subscribe to my channel for more episodes. Thanks for listening.